Theory of Plates and Shells with Heart or Brain, number 1550, VPT 103, February 25, 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation, Category, Methodology Engineering and Heart or Brain. Preface and Introduction, From Plates and Shells to the Beating Heart. When I look back at what I studied at MIT under Professor Norman Jones in the early 1970s and compare it with what I am doing today in chronic disease research, I no longer see two different disciplines. I see the same physical system expressed through different materials, different geometries, and different scales. In those years I worked on the dynamic behavior of plates and shell structures under repeated impact loading. A flat plate and a curved shell respond in different ways, yet both are governed by the same energy principles. A plate mainly resists load through bending and in plane stress, while a shell, because of its curvature, carries load more efficiently through membrane action. Under repeated loading, both structures gradually change their internal condition. Their stiffness evolves, local deformation increases, and their safety margin slowly declines. The critical issue was never a single impact. The real question was how much total energy had entered the structure and how much of that energy could be dissipated without producing permanent damage. Heat was an essential part of that understanding. During cyclic loading, a portion of mechanical energy was always converted into heat through internal friction and plastic deformation. This heat was not just a byproduct. It was the visible sign that energy was being absorbed and that fatigue was taking place. When the rate of heat generation exceeded the structure's ability to dissipate it, local softening and failure followed. Mechanical behavior and thermal behavior were therefore two aspects of the same energy process. Many decades later, from 1984 to 2004, I went through 5 cardiac episodes and survived. When I began to examine the cardiovascular system through long-term data collected from my own body, I suddenly recognized the same structural logic. The left ventricle, a hollow cavity within an organ, is neither a pure plate nor a pure shell, yet it contains features of both. Its wall has thickness like a plate, but its curved geometry allows it to function as a pressure vessel, similar to a shell. With every heartbeat it shortens, thickens, bends, and relaxes. Blood pressure acts as the repeated internal load. The myocardial tissue heart muscle absorbs, stores, and dissipates energy in each cycle. This geometric form is not accidental. In engineering, a shell structure reduces stress by distributing load along its curved surface. In the heart, the ventricular curvature allows the pressure inside the chamber to be converted into wall tension in a highly efficient way. However, when the material properties of the wall change, for example through long-term metabolic disorder, fibrosis, the thickening and scarring of connective tissue, usually as a result of injury, or hypertrophy, the enlargement of an organ or tissue due to an increase in cell size, the same internal pressure produces higher wall stress because the structure has lost part of its elasticity and reserve. This is directly comparable to a plate or shell that has undergone fatigue. The load may be unchanged, but the internal condition is no longer the same. Metabolism plays a role similar to heat in structural mechanics. Part of biochemical energy is converted into mechanical work, and part is dissipated as thermal energy. In a healthy system, this energy flow is balanced and efficient. In a metabolically disordered state, the energy process becomes less efficient, more energy is lost, and the material properties of the tissue gradually change. What we observe clinically is ventricular remodeling. The heart slowly changes its size, shape, and stiffness because of long-term stresses. From an engineering point of view, a structural adaptation to long-term loading. This is why two individuals with similar blood pressure readings can have completely different cardiac outcomes. In structural mechanics, two components subjected to the same peak force may survive or fail depending on their geometry, their material condition, and their cumulative energy history. The same principle applies to the heart. The decisive factor is not the single measurement but the remaining structural reserve. For this reason, I do not interpret chronic disease through isolated laboratory values. A single number is equivalent to measuring the load on a plate or a shell at one instant. It cannot reveal fatigue, energy accumulation, or remaining life. Only a continuous record can show how the structure has evolved over time. For example, in one of my recent research papers comparing my stroke risk with my wife's, her TSIA proxy for pressure pulse load and SPP amplification was higher than mine, yet her vascular structural strength was better than mine, while I was the one who experienced the stroke recently. The continuity from my previous mid-engineering studies to my present medical research work is therefore proven to be even more complete. In the 1970s, I studied how plates and shells survived repeated impacts and how mechanical energy was transformed into heat and irreversible deformation. Today, I study how the blood vessels of the heart and brain respond to repeated hemodynamic and metabolic loading, and how biological energy is transformed into function, dissipation, adaptation, and eventual failure if the reserve is exhausted. The material has changed from steel and concrete to living tissue and organs, but the governing physics has not changed. Both are time-dependent and path-dependent systems. Both accumulate damage through energy input. Both survive according to their remaining structural margin. This is the academic origin of one of my present main research methodologies in biomedicine and health. I begin with load, energy, geometry, and time. Because that is how real structures, whether mechanical or biological, live, thrive, adapt, and fail. Comparison. What I studied with Professor Norman Jones at MIT in the early 1970s was the structural behavior under repeated dynamic loading. At that time, the subject was steel plates, shells, and other structural components that were struck again and again by external forces. We were interested in how much they bent, how the internal stress was distributed, how much energy they could absorb, and how long they could survive before permanent damage appeared. A plate that is clamped along all four edges and hit repeatedly at its center does not fail from one single impact. Each impact adds a small amount of deformation and a small amount of internal damage. If the material is strong and flexible, the plate spreads the load, stores some energy temporarily, dissipates some of it, and then returns close to its original shape. If the material becomes stiffer, thinner, or already fatigued, the same force produces larger deformation, higher internal stress, and less recovery after each hit. Eventually, the plate reaches a point where it can no longer absorb the incoming energy, and failure occurs. 5 decades later, when I began to study chronic disease in my own body, I suddenly recognized that the same physical principles were operating inside my organs and the cardiovascular system, and even the cerebral system. The heart muscle behaves like a living structural plate that I'm being loaded rhythmically from within. Every heartbeat is a loading cycle. Blood pressure is the force. The ventricular, the heart's main pumping chamber wall, is the structural material. The deformation is the contraction and relaxation of the myocardium, the muscle of the heart wall. The internal stress corresponds to the mechanical and metabolic burden carried by the heart muscle. For a healthy heart, the wall has enough thickness, elasticity, and energy dissipation capacity to handle this repeated loading. It deforms efficiently during contraction and then returns to its resting state during relaxation. This is the same as a well-designed steel plate or shell that bends under impact but does not accumulate permanent damage. However, when long-term metabolic disorders are present, the material properties of the heart begin to change. Chronic hypertension increases the load. Diabetes and inflammation alter the tissue structure. Fibrosis, scar tissue buildup, makes the wall stiffer and less able to relax. Now the same pressure produces higher internal stress and less efficient deformation. The heart is no longer working as an elastic energy storage system but as a fatigued structure that consumes more energy for the same output. This is exactly what we observed in structural mechanics. The critical factor was never the single peak force. The critical factor was the total energy delivered over time and the remaining structural reserve. A bridge does not collapse because one heavy truck crosses it on one day. It collapses after years of accumulated loading that slowly reduces its safety margin. In the same way, my heart or a blood vessel in my brain does not fail because of one high glucose reading or one episode of high blood pressure. Heart failure is the final stage of a long process in which energy has been repeatedly applied to a structure whose ability to absorb and dissipate that energy has been progressively reduced. There is also a direct parallel in the concept of recovery and damping. In structural impact, a healthy system stops vibrating quickly because it can dissipate energy efficiently. In the heart, a healthy heart muscle relaxes smoothly and fills efficiently when this energy dissipation mechanism is impaired. Structural vibration is equivalent to a heart chamber that has become stiff and cannot relax. During filling, the system fails to return to its baseline state before the next cycle, and cumulative damage accelerates. On June 21, 2025, a single surge of acute high blood pressure ruptured a calcified microvessel in my brain and nearly cost me my life, what I did not fully appreciate in the 1970s, but understand clearly today, is that biological tissue behaves more like a time-dependent material such as soil than like an ideal elastic metal such as steel. Its response depends on the entire loading history. It remodels, it stiffens, it partially repairs, it accumulates irreversible changes. This path-dependent behavior is the reason why two individuals with the same blood pressure today can have completely different cardiac outcomes. Their structural histories are different. This continuous intellectual line from blast-resistant structural design of nuclear power plants or naval battleships to chronic disease analysis explains why my research does not begin with statistical correlation or single laboratory thresholds. My first question is always structural and energetic. How much total load has been applied? How has the material changed over time? How much energy has been stored? And how much reserve capacity remains? In the early years, the structure was made of steel and concrete, and the validation came from desert blast experiments or navy yards. Today, the structure is made of living cells and tissues, and the validation comes from 17 years of continuous pathophysiological data. The physical domain has changed, but the governing principles have not. Both systems are structures under repeated load. Both accumulate damage energy over time. Both survive or fail depending on their remaining structural reserve. Conclusion: this is the direct connection between what I learned under Professor Norman Jones at mid in 1972 and what I am doing in biomedical research more than 50 years later. One more fact worthy of mentioning is that my work in artificial intelligence has always been on the side of theory, system structure, and governing mechanisms rather than software tool development. I focus on understanding how real systems behave over time and use computation as an accelerator for verification and communication through persistent self-study of medicine, disease mechanisms, clinical outcomes, and healthy lifestyle control. I have extended my biological life from 65 to 68 and now to 79, surviving 9 major mortality challenges. My engineering studies served my professional career in society, but my medical studies served my health and longevity. Disclaimer: I write this paper not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand their health, prevent disease, and live longer, healthier lives. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to T. The author, Gerald C. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.